most respected guest speaker for the day, LisaHasker, who's the CEO of VICSPORT, Rosa Dickish-Miller,
perfectly pronounced,
from Austria, Dr. G. Kishore, who's the Principal and Regional Director, Sujit, distinguished guests, and my dear friends. Indeed, it's a great honor for us where we have eminent personalities, experts, we could say almost top-rated experts in the world, addressing and sharing their views in the platform of physical education community coaching in India. So I feel on behalf of the Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports, Halo India, a warm welcome to Ma'am Lisa and also to Rosa. A welcome to Kishore sir and all the participants who are attending this program, the international speaker session. I would like to introduce, I take this opportunity to introduce Lisa. Lisa is the CEO of VICSPORT, the peak body for sport in Victoria. She comes to the role with a wealth of industry knowledge and experience, including board position at AFL Sports Ready Foundation, Shooting Australia, Athletics Victoria, and Australian Sponsorship Marketing Association. Most recently, Lisa has been the GM, General Manager of the Community and Stakeholder Relations in Basketball Australia. In this role, Lisa managed the media, digital marketing events, and participation and commercial functions. Lisa has studied physical education, exercise science, sport management, and holds a Master's of Marketing, former manager of Latrobe Sports at Latrobe University. Lisa developed and implemented the strategy to enhance Latrobe University's brand and has served as manager of public affairs and sponsorship at the Victorian Institute of Sport, CEO at Victorian Little Athletics Association, and marketing manager at Victorian Golf Association. Ma'am, a warm welcome to you. I also would like to introduce Ms. Rosa. I'm indeed thankful for Rosa Dickish-Miller, who's the Assistant Professor, University of Vienna, Austria, Europe, Department of Sports Science and Sports Pedagogy. She's also the Vice President of the International Association for Physical Education and Sport for Girls and Women. Researcher in the area of sports pedagogy, health promotion, gender studies. She's a lecturer in the Austrian Coach Education for Gender Mainstreaming and Diversity Management, founder of the Australian Platform for Women and Sport. She's also the member of the European Expert Pool of Sexual Violence in Sport. Indeed, madam, it's a great honor for us to have you among the panelists. A warm welcome to you too. May I now request Lisa for her session. Ma'am, please.
Thank you, Usha. Sorry if my pronunciation is bad. Welcome everyone. It's great to be chatting to over 700 people in India. I have visited India and loved every minute of my visit. Fascinating and beautiful country, beautiful people. It's great to be chatting to PE teachers as well. I am a former PE teacher. I worked in a school in Melbourne for 7 years teaching PE, science and maths. And then I decided that I wanted to pursue a career in sport. And I moved into various roles with which Usha has outlined. So I've worked in lots of sports, both state sports from my particular state of Victoria, which Melbourne is the capital, and also Australian sports like Basketball Australia. And that's where I reconnected with our esteemed colleague Janice Crosswhite, who's hopefully listening to us today. So it's fantastic to be talking to like-minded people that want to get children active. My current job is to look after all the sports associations in Victoria. So in the area of community sport, so Basketball Victoria, Athletics Victoria, Bocce Victoria, Shooting Victoria, Swimming Victoria, Water Polo Victoria, all those different sports are our members at VICSPORT, and we help them with a variety of things, which I'll chat about while I talk about volunteering. But most of those sports are entirely run by volunteers in Australia. There's a few big sports like AFL football, soccer, swimming, tennis, that have quite a big professional staff, but most of the activity run on a weekend, when it's not COVID time, is run by volunteers. So I'll take you through how that works in Australia, because without volunteers, we would not have community sport. We'd have sport in schools, like you deliver, and the kids would have an opportunity to learn their skills and practice them in a school environment. But in Australia, the community sports setting on the weekend is really important, because that's the setting where you get chosen for state, national and international teams. So if you are elite, you need to be in the community environment on the weekend playing your sport, rather than just the school environment. So those volunteers running sport on the weekend and training after school are really important. So my job is to help those sports with whatever they need help with. And obviously at the moment, my major role is around COVID-19. So we have been helping sport get funding from the government to survive in this time, because obviously there's not much money in community sport, hence why it's run by mostly volunteers. Now that our cases of COVID-19 are dropping, we are starting to open up sport. So at the moment, community sport is allowed just to train 1.5 metres apart, with lots of hand sanitizer and lots of safety procedures, and no use of the clubhouse, only use of bathrooms. So we are now using a lot of our time coaching the sports on how to bring people back safely. But also it's kind of a bit of a silver lining for sport, because we weren't spending our time out on the oval or the park or the pool. We've had a chance to look at training our volunteers, reviewing our child safe policies, reviewing our strategic plans and our governance, and looking at our digital platforms and making sure that kind of the back end of sport is improved, because they were the things that no one ever gets a chance to do, because you're always out coaching or being an administrator or playing your sport. So I'll take you through the volunteering side of things, and then I'm happy to take any questions. I won't talk for too long, because you don't want to hear the Aussie in a winter Saturday afternoon for too long. But let me take you through how it works in Australia. There we go. So all of you will know what volunteering is. Basically, it's us doing something for the common good without any financial gain. Now, we happen to be talking about volunteering in sport, but we could be volunteering for the Red Cross, we could be volunteering reading to children, we could be volunteering at a food bank, but obviously my world is around volunteering in sport. Now in Australia, these are old figures, but we've got a lot of volunteers working across all different industries in Australia. And in 1995 to 2010, that volume of volunteers jumped from 3.2 million to 6.1 million, and now it's even more than that these days. So Australians love their volunteering, and people volunteer at all sorts of places, obviously some of which is sport. In sport, we have about 1.8 million people. So to give you some comparison, so in Australia we have about, I think, 23 million people in the whole country. So very different to India, where we're spread out. So 1.8 million volunteering in just sport is a big number for us. So these people get out at night after school hours and get out on the weekend and basically run sport, whatever sport they might be interested in. A lot of people get involved because they played the sport themselves. Some get involved because their children played the sport and they stay on forever. We at VICSPORT hold an awards night each year to reward various different elements of the sporting industry. And we had a person who won Volunteer of the Year in the previous year's awards, and they had been volunteering at their sporting club for 50 years. So since they were about 20 years old. So people get in and they get involved and they love it. And without them, we wouldn't have the opportunity to run sport as we do in Australia. So if we had to pay those volunteers, the estimate is that it would cost us $4 billion annually if we were paying them as professionals. So we're very lucky that people are willing to give up their time and spend a lot of time at their club doing whatever they do at each club. They may come in as the president of the club, be on the committee, they might be the coach, they might help with the grounds, they might help in the canteen, they might help with the equipment. There's lots of different roles that people take on, and we're lucky that they do that and they stay with it to help us run sport. To give you a bit of an idea of how sport works in Australia, and this is a little bit old, some of the names have changed quite recently, but we have elite sport where we have the Australian Institute of Sport, and then each state has their own institute or academy. So that's where our elite athletes, the ones that are going to Com Games, going to Olympics, that's where they can go and get support and opportunities to train with the best exercise scientists and coaches. Then we have community sport, and most of the volunteers work from the bottom of the grey area of this chart in the sporting clubs, the district sporting body, or the state or province sporting body. So we've got the millions of people out there in sporting clubs each weekend and each night of the week helping us run sport. The national body, like Basketball Australia, where I used to work, or Swimming Australia or Athletics Australia, that's mostly made up of professional staff that run the sport and that help produce the teams that are sent by Australia to Commonwealth Games and Olympics. Then we have some agencies that help us look after sport. So the Australian Sports Commission, which is now called Sport Australia, the Australian Sports Anti-Doping Authority, who we're about to move into a new unit there, and various government sports agencies. So the Sports Commission is the one that mostly looks after the national sporting bodies like Basketball Australia, but they also do a lot of work creating resources for volunteers and the people that work in sport. The Anti-Doping Authority, or what's soon to become Sport Integrity Australia, looks after making sure that our athletes are clean and not using drugs, and also looks after making sure that sport as a whole in Australia is clean, whether it be around betting or cheating in any way. So that authority spends all their time on making sure that sport in Australia is clean in every way. I suspect, like Indians, you know, Aussies like things to be fair, and that's about making sure that sport is fair and that you're competing on an equal footing when you turn up to a championship. Our state government sports agencies provide the funding in each state for sport. So in Victoria, which is where our capital city is Melbourne, we have an authority called Sport and Recreation Victoria, and they provide me with funding as well as funding for all the sports to make sure that the Australian community can access sport in a relatively cheap way. So without that government support, sport would start to get quite expensive. because, as you would understand, there's lots of things to pay for when you hire grounds, produce uniforms. Some of the coaches might be paid in some sports, some of the players might be paid. So sport is getting a bit expensive. So government helps us make sure that that remains fair. And then we have our local councils in Australia. So they're the ones that own 99% of the facilities. So they own the tennis courts, they own the hockey fields, they own the athletics tracks, they own the football fields, the soccer fields, and most sport will turn to those local councils to hire the facilities to run their sport. So the volunteers are the ones at the sport club level that have the relationship with the local councils. And they will sign a lease and they will run their sport from a particular place that that local council owns. Now, at the moment, we've just come out of a period, obviously, where we've cancelled all sport. So we had about 2.5 months with no sport at all, everything closed to make sure people are safe from COVID. And now we're just starting to open up. So part of my role is to support volunteers in how they can open up and following the rules from our Chief Health Officer. So at the moment we're allowed to train only, as I said before, 1.5 metres apart, with lots of hand sanitizer and protecting our people, particularly our older volunteers, making sure that they understand how to stay safe. And so part of our role is to make sure that all the clubs and all the volunteers understand what they need to do to keep people safe, but also to follow the rules. Because we are under a state of emergency here in Victoria. So if you don't follow the rules, you could find yourself with a quite heavy fine. And that's been put into action by the government to make sure we stay safe. And it seems to be working. So hopefully it will continue to work, fingers crossed. Apart from making sure that sport keeps running, volunteering, there's been a lot of research that's gone on into volunteering around the world, and Rosa would know a lot about this, in the benefits for the actual volunteer. So, you know, sport in Australia would not run without volunteers, but the volunteers hopefully are getting a lot from their experience. You know, making sure that they're maintaining good mental health, they're keeping fit themselves, they're connected to their community, and they get a lot of positive experience from helping people in the sport that they grew up in. So it's a really important part of Australian society, and there has been a lot of work done in the last 3 months around trying to get back to sport and community activity as soon as possible, because there's been a huge acknowledgement of mental health issues that have come out of COVID as a result of people not being able to go to their club and mix with their friends. So the sooner we get back, the better. But on the flip side, if we push the volunteer too hard and make them do too many extra hours, we tend to find they get a bit tired and go away. So there's a balance between getting people involved and them being excited and feeling positive about that involvement, and then maybe getting them a bit too tired and sending them away. So it's really up to people like me and people that work in each of the sports to make sure the system's in place to make sure those volunteers feel really welcome, and the participants feel welcome, so they want to stay in that particular sport. And we're doing a lot of work in that area about making sure clubs are welcoming and safe. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. The other thing that's popping up more and more, particularly in Australia and America, is digital systems that help you manage your volunteers, particularly around big events like Commonwealth Games, big events like Tough Mudder, fun runs where you have hundreds of volunteers working on a particular event. It's a bit like running a big company of staff, and you need to make sure you know who's where, who's got what training, who's got their working with children checks, who is an official coach and is allowed on the field and who isn't. Who are your referees? Are they trained? Which referees are going with which team? So there's been a lot of work in the last few years making sure that we're training our volunteers and then we're keeping track of them. Really important to provide volunteers with the opportunity to improve their skills and look after them so they can do a better job each time they turn up to sport. Some of the resources that we work on at VICSPORT, and we do a lot of this work in conjunction with government, is making sure that the clubs are inclusive for volunteers and also inclusive for obviously the participants, but volunteers in particular, because they're the ones that are going to stay in the club for a long time. So we want to include women. There has been a lack of women involved in senior volunteer positions and coaching positions and board positions at clubs and sporting organisations in Australia. In Victoria, we have a rule now that you will not get government funding unless you have 40% of women on your sporting board. So if you are, say, Baseball Victoria, and you don't have 40% women on your governing board, you will not be eligible for government funding. So in the past 2.5 years, VICSPORT, my organisation, has done a lot of work with sport to make sure that we are attracting more women to senior positions on boards in sport. We need to be more inclusive and attract people that think differently, do things differently, and the quota system that we've been using has focused on women to start with. But in clubland, we're also focusing on making sure we attract Indigenous participants and volunteers, people from the LGBTIQ community, and people with a disability. Because we find that sporting clubs, particularly in Australia, can be quite masculine. We talk about a locker room mentality, and it's usually attached to male sport, football type sports, where there's a lot of slapping on the back and congratulating each other and maybe some swearing and maybe a bit of drinking, and that is not really very welcoming for a lot of different groups apart from men. So we have been focusing very much in sport in Australia on making sure that our volunteers and our participants feel welcome, whatever community they come from, whether it be an international community, whether they're a woman, whether they have a disability, whether they might be gay or they're Indigenous. We want them to play sport. So we've been doing a lot of work there. And if you go to our website, you'll see a lot of resources on our website around attracting Indigenous people to playing and working in sport, and also just generally welcoming people into sport. So it's something that we've been focusing on here. The other thing that we've been focusing on and training our volunteers in is child safety measures and rules. In Victoria, in my particular state, it is actually legislation, so government law legislation, that people in clubs must adhere to 7 child safety principles. So it's a big burden on volunteers to coach, run the club, run the canteen, choose the team, get the uniform, make sure they're following the liquor licenses, make sure they're being welcoming, make sure they've got everyone organised. Now they've got to make sure they've got all the COVID rules in place, and they've got to make sure they're child safe. But we're trying to make it easier for the volunteers by providing a lot of resources and making it easy for them to adhere to all the rules they need to adhere to. But child safety is a really important one. There's been a lot of royal commissions in Australia around terrible things that have happened to children in various community groups, not only sport. Churches, other community areas, community groups, different schools, all different things have had problems. So we are now doing a lot of work with making sure that all of our clubs are child safe, all of our volunteers have working with children checks, all of our volunteers understand the 7 child safe principles to make sure that any child in any sporting club is safe and feels safe when they come to our clubs. So that's been a focus for the last few years, but it will continue to be a focus to make sure that we're being welcoming in that area. The other area is governance, so making sure that the volunteers run their club well and don't get themselves into any trouble, whether it be financial trouble or not growing or not being welcoming. They need to have a really good committee that understands governance and that can attract people to that club and create an atmosphere that everyone wants to be part of. So we do a lot of work on governance, and you'll see on our website that we have a governance toolkit which takes people through all the areas of governance that you need to look after if you're going to run a great sporting club or a great company or a great school. It could be the same for all of those. So it's universal principles really for running an organisation. As I talked about before, we do a lot of work around welcoming, making sure sport is welcoming. I kind of talk about sport, which is my industry, as being relatively old-fashioned. You know, if you want to turn up to fencing, this is how it's run, this is the days that it's on, this is the uniform you will wear, and this is how it goes. We have been producing different sports in exactly the same way for a long time. And we've been working with sport to try to get them to do sport differently. We call it here in Victoria, and La Trobe Uni and La Trobe University have done a lot of work with us around coaching sports to be innovative and coaching volunteers to be innovative. Why do you have to do fencing that way? Why do you have to use a heavy shot put in athletics? Why couldn't you use something else for children? Why, you know, why do we always think we have to do it the same way as it was done 30 years ago? So one of the silver linings of COVID is that we're doing a lot more work in the area of doing sport differently and being welcoming, because a lot of people might not come back to sport after they've been in isolation for a while, because they may not be able to afford community sport because a lot of people have lost their jobs. They may be scared to come back to community sport and mix with people because they've been hidden away and protecting themselves from COVID. Or they might just look at their sport and think, wow, that actually wasn't that fun. Why am I going there? Why am I paying my money to go to that sport and it's not actually that good? So sports are going to have to be a lot more innovative in Australia to attract people to spend their spare time and their spare money coming to that particular sport. So that's a big piece of work we're doing with sport at the moment, and I'm hoping that COVID is actually going to provide a silver lining in this situation. Fingers crossed. The other work that we're doing a lot with and coaching volunteers on is encouraging them to look after and support people with a disability to come to their sport. And obviously, depending on the disability, it is not always easy with certain facilities and certain sports to integrate people with a disability into your sport. So we're doing a lot of work coaching the volunteers on how to do this and how to be welcoming for people with a disability and how to look after people with a disability in their sport. And that's been really encouraging to see a lot of those, particularly children, come into a particular sport and then work their way up through the system and end up coming to a Paralympics. So that's awesome. Or coming to a Commonwealth Games, which is now fully integrated meet. So, you know, that's really encouraging, and we can do a lot more work in that space. Hopefully encouraging more people with a disability to come and play sport in some way, shape or form. As I touched on before, one of the things that is really tricky, particularly in a big sport or at a big event, is actually tracking, training and taking roll call, basically, for your volunteers. With our child safe laws, you know, volunteers can't turn up to a particular stadium without working with children checks. We need to make sure we've got the right people at the right time delivering big events. We need to make sure that we, as a sport, are training our volunteers properly. So here's a couple of different, Scoodlo, Rosterify and Vol. They're 3 different platforms that basically provide HR and tracking systems for volunteers. but it's really important to be able to manage volunteers at those big events and at a local club level. So some of these systems help you at the small level or for really big events as well. So just in summary, before I take some questions and we go to the panel. So in Australia, sport would not survive without volunteers. If the volunteers all decided not to come back, most of our sport at community level would fold. We'd have children doing sport in schools with PE teachers like yourselves, but there'd be nothing for them to compete and test themselves in their favourite sport after school on the weekend. So, you know, we're, for a small country, in terms of population, we've always been relatively successful on the world stage in sport because of this volunteer support and people playing their favourite sport on the weekend. But we must make sure now, as there's a lot more options in Australia, a lot more things to do, a lot more opportunities in your spare time, we've got to make sure that we are training our volunteers really well and we're supporting them really well so that they want to stay in sport, and we can rely on them to run that sport for years. You know, every sport, if you talk to people in Australia who play sport, they all know the volunteer that's been at that, working at that sport for 40, 50 years. They'll know the person who's been the timekeeper at the end of the swimming pool for all their career. They'll know the person at the footy club who's laced and cleaned the boots for 30 years. You know, and these become their friends, and it becomes part of the appeal of going to those particular clubs and being part of sport. So it's really important that we keep training them, and that's part of our role at VICSPORT, to make sure that there's resources that sporting organisations and clubs can use to make the life of a volunteer just a little bit easier. And hopefully we go some of the way to do that. So thank you for listening. And there'll be a few questions. I'm not sure how Usha's going to manage the questions, but I'm sure she will. She'll get a gold medal for that. So we'll go to questions, and I think Rose is going to jump in and answer some of the questions as well. So we'll see how we go. Usha's run away. Here she comes. I wonder how she's going to do that.
No, she's lost.
Oh, here we go. She's lost. I'm looking at some of the questions.
Now she's here.
Yeah. Thank you, Lisha, for this wonderful narration that you've given us. It's an input which we are looking forward to. And this particular program is physical education and community coaching. Community coaching, we haven't started in a formal way in our country. So what would you suggest to start with? How could we start in a country like India? It's a pilot project. How could we take the initiative?
Well, I think most of our coaches in Australia start by ending up at a club with their children, and they end up putting their hand up to coach the team. Or they might be one of the participants who's quite young and they show an interest in coaching or refereeing, and they do that. Now, what the next step is they do a basic coaching course. So we have a series of coaching courses, the first of which in most sports is called Community Coach. So it's a few hours of someone teaching them the basics of coaching, of safety, of child safe, and of the skills of that particular sport. So that's where people start, and they'll do a community coaching course, which in the old days used to be called a level O, and then you went to level 1, 2, 3. Now it depends on the sport what they call it, but most of the beginner courses are community coaching courses. And when I was a PE student, like most of the people on your call, we did some of those coaching courses as part of our PE degree. So we came out with an understanding of coaching from a couple of subjects in the course. We also came out with some specific coaching, community coaching level 1 type courses for basketball, lacrosse, tennis, and a few sports that we were interested in coaching. So, you know, probably the first thing is to decide who are the people that might coach in the Indian community, how can we give them a taste of the basics of coaching? Are they just the PE teachers that might coach some teams outside the classroom? Are they members of the community? I'm sure there's a million billion cricket coaches in India that would be absolutely fantastic at taking the next level and coaching bigger groups of children if they were given the opportunity. I think, you know, that your interest in sport is paramount and very impressive. So it'd be fantastic to give them the opportunity to upskill and give the opportunity to more people to improve their particular sport. Not just cricket, maybe more sports.
Thank you. It was good, indeed good. And we look forward to some of the basics and your guidance too. So, Dr. Sanjay Prajapati, for the next question, please.
Thank you, ma'am. Lisa, ma'am, I have a question for you. How do you motivate volunteer for sports? Do we provide incentive for them?
In terms of the coaches?
Volunteer.
How do we motivate volunteer for sports?
So
do you provide any incentive?
I think you're referring, are we still referring to coaches or just volunteers?
It's volunteer coaching.
Volunteers?
Yeah. Any sort of an incentive that you tend to do this year? Yeah.
Look, most of our volunteer coaches in Australia in clubs would get a cup of tea, maybe a t-shirt, and maybe a handshake at the end of the day. That's about it. There'd be a few referees and umpires that would get a bit of a payment for doing their particular volunteer role, but most of the volunteers do it for no payment, and they're just happy to be part of the team and maybe get a polo shirt and a hat to wear as part of their role. So no, there's not many incentives. It's really mostly born on goodwill.
Maybe some comment?
Yeah, sure.
Go, Rob.
Sure.
As you've told, Lisa, you're totally right. It's the small things they get. On the other hand, they get maybe being known in the community, being on social media, being allowed to travel to different competitions, being part of a community. There are so many informal incentives they get. And as we know from different studies on motivation and being a volunteer, these are the important things. So you have to give them that they're very important, they're important for the society, they're important for the community. And for most of the volunteers, these are the aspects which count more than a financial incentive, for example.
Next question.
Yes.
Hello. Next question, ma'am. What is the selection criteria of volunteer in Australia?
Is that the one about swimming?
Yeah, swimming, yeah.
Swimming. It depends on the job you want at swimming. So if I was going along to watch my godchildren swim, I always grab a stopwatch and help do the timing, and I don't need any particular training for that. If I was one of the umpires at swimming, at a swimming meet, I might need some training about the rules of swimming and what things I might be need to look for in a swimmer if they're going to be disqualified or something in a race. So it depends on the role, but most roles, there's not really any criteria. It's really learning on the job, putting your hand up, and then someone who's been there for a while will take you under their wing. And then if you are really keen, you then might take a formal course in some part of volunteering in that particular sport to get you to move up move up the ladder. Because a lot of people will start just by helping out. Then they'll really love their role as a volunteer and they'll do some training. And then they might even aspire to be a volunteer for swimming at the Commonwealth Games or the National Championships or the Olympics. So they take it a bit like an elite athlete. They keep climbing up the ladder. But most people will just be pointed at, and it's you over here. I need you on the long jump pit, or I need you in the swimming timing. Because in a lot of sports, it takes a lot of volunteers to run the particular sport. In something like basketball, one scorer, one umpire, and you're right to go. But in athletics, if you're running a whole athletics meet, you need people at long jump, people at shot put, people at javelin, people to put up the hurdles, people to start, people to run the pole vault. So you need, a lot of people. So the criteria depends a bit on what sport and what level you might be at.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question from my side. What step, am I audible, ma'am? Yeah. What step we should take to promote volunteers in sports in India?
In India, well, I suppose I don't pretend to understand the system of sports in India. I know you're very sporty. I know you love sport. You've obviously got very keen PE teachers who are dialing in to learn on a Saturday. But I think it'll be a matter of encouraging people to come to some formal place. So if you have a cricket club, encouraging people to come and help, and making sure that they actually have a really worthwhile job to do when they get there. So how are you going to help them be involved? Are they going to coach? Are they going to be part of a committee that looks after the equipment? What are they going to do? But volunteers just want to be wanted and needed, and want to make sure they're doing a good job. So it's a matter of kind of creating that environment. So then you'll get people, I'm sure there'll be lots of people that would love to help. It's a matter also of making sure that you're running the activities when people have spare time. And obviously not a lot of people have spare time. They're working all the time. So making sure you do the activities at a time that people are able to come and help.
Thank you, ma'am. Over to Dr. Usaish Nair, ma'am.
It's indeed so nice listening to you. There's one of the questions that just come in is, how is it Australia is doing so good in sports? What could be the possible reason you're excelling in I'm talking of the elite level sports?
We've been amazingly lucky. I mean, I think we did very well for many years, and then when we didn't win a gold medal at one Olympics, the government panicked and they built the Australian Institute of Sport to make sure that we lift again in elite sport. But I think the reason we are very successful is we have a lifestyle of being outside. We have a lifestyle of being fit and healthy. We are lucky here to have very good food, a lot of which we grow locally. And we there's a concept of mateship in Australia that encourages people to get into community groups, and sport has been one thing that has been has been part of most people's lives in some way, shape or form. So I think with all of that together, we have ended up being strong in sport, maybe compared to other nations of a similar size of population. And we've just got to maintain it, keep winning a few medals, hope that Tokyo goes ahead.
That's right. So thank you. Then there's just one more. You said you're going to reopen after the COVID, and you've taken certain precautions. Even in India, there are certain precautions which have been laid down. How should they come in? But there's always a fear in the on the side of the parents, like what will happen to the children. So what kind of a message could we give to the parents so that we know that these are the rules and guidelines, but how you think we could spread a message that should be fine and they could get back into the activity?
Yeah, look, it's a really weird one. It's a good question, Usha, because in Australia we are mostly back at school. We've even in Victoria, which is the last state to get back, we've got the kind of young ones back and the older ones that are doing final years back. And then after this long weekend, this weekend, everyone else goes back to school. And they're not social distancing in a school. we can't fit 35 kids in a classroom and spread them out. So once they're in the school, they're all together. But when they come out to play football, AFL football or soccer or netball, we're telling them to spread out. So it's kind of a bit weird because the rules of community are different to the rules from school. So in a way, they're probably safer at the community sport where they have to be distanced. They have to come to the activity, wash their hands, play sport with their own ball, not touch anyone else's equipment, and then go straight home. They can't use the change rooms, they can't use the showers, they can only use the toilet if needed. So it's, you know, there's a lot of safety measures, and they're probably, as I said, in a way, safer in the sporting club than they are squished into a classroom. But we're yet to see how that will work. Because one thing to add as well is the first level of getting back to sport in Australia is training only. So no competition, no tackling, no touching, none of that. Just training, just kicking a ball or throwing a ball by yourself with your own equipment. So it might be a bit different or a bit harder to convince the parents of the safety when they're tackling their friends and jumping on top of each other and, you know, doing their rugby and their football and they're all, you know, in. That could be a lot trickier because it's, it might be a bit of a harder argument, Usha, when you're trying to explain that one to a parent.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, Dr. Sanjay, you have any questions further? There are a lot of questions.
The question is, for a qualified professional, please suggest any community coaching course program.
Hang on, I'm going to look at that.
Do you have any suggestions?
Q&A. Can you just, I'm just looking, is that one of the questions on the Q&A?
Yeah,
ma'am.
Yeah. Rosa could also help.
Yeah. Could you repeat the question again?
For a qualified professional, please suggest any community coaching courses, if you can suggest.
So in Austria and in Germany, it's quite similar to both of our countries. We have a program in educating volunteers, and we have different subjects in it. And on the one hand, this is one aspect why volunteers are so interested in this work, because they get these education courses for free, and they learn quite a lot for their skills in it. For example, how to communicate, how to teach different groups, also how to organize a club in terms of management skills they get there. And we try to offer these courses to all the different functions in the sports clubs. So for different functions, they get different courses. And I think this is very important for the professionalization of the officials and of the volunteers. And on the other hand, we also have to look, because the situation of volunteers is changing quite a lot. The age structure is changing, they're getting older, what is good on the one hand, but on the other hand, we have to look how to keep young people in. So if they're an athlete, it would be important to keep them, that they don't drop out from their sports and then they're gone. So we have to look for programs how to keep young people who are physically active and then stay for other functions as a volunteer in the club. So these are different aspects and programs we are trying to keep the people in the clubs, and we have to try to have volunteers in different age groups. And also what we have to do quite a lot is keeping and getting women in the clubs, because as you've told also in Australia, it's quite similar in Austria and Germany. We have 1/3 women, 2/3 men, and also in the boards 3/4, so 75% are male and 25% female. So there's a lot to do also in terms of getting different ethnic groups or persons with migrant background. We normally don't get them into our boards and not into the volunteer work. So there's lots to do for us. And as you've told, Lisa, the welcoming aspect, I think this is one of the most important aspects. How welcomingly is a club? And there we have to work on the culture and on the atmosphere of a club. I think there's a lot to do, and it sounds easy if you speak about it, but it's not easy to implement and to fulfill this criteria.
Yeah. The next question is asked by Ritesh Chokse. What is the future of volunteers in sports?
In terms of child safe?
No, future volunteers. Once again, to the volunteer, what would they get benefit early, as I said, in their scope? Will this have an added value in any other?
It's a very hard question to answer for your point of view. I think I'm not really sure I understand the question, so I'm just looking.
If a person is doing maybe these many hours of volunteer service, do you think that this could add, like you say, maybe into your bio, like which can help you to add onto your profiling, or which can give you some sort of an advantage in terms of a career too?
Yeah, well, I'll speak for someone that I hire people. I've been hiring people for 25 years to work in sport. So some people have come from physical education courses. Some people have come from sport management courses. If they have volunteered in a sport in their own time for nothing, as well as doing their study, I look onto that much more positively than a person who has not. So, it's great. We obviously all have to do some study to get to our professional status, but people that do stuff in their own time and volunteer and support children and other people in a sport, then that is looked upon, particularly in Australia, I'm sure it's the same in Austria, that is looked upon very highly, that a young person who's studying has done extra in their own time. So I think there probably are a lot of volunteers that are sitting watching this, that are doing PE, that their favourite sport is tennis, and they could help in a club and use their skills as a teacher and a coach, and build their CV for their professional life in sport. So I think there's that side of things as well.
This is also shown in different studies that there is a big advantage if you have in your CV having been a volunteer in sports.
Yeah, very positive.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am.
Thanks.
The next question is whether they are gaining any source of income in Australia, volunteer. Whether they have any source of income.
There'll be a few that do, not many. Most volunteer for free, but there'll be a few, like I know in basketball, some of the young children and adults get some pocket money and some payment for being a referee or an umpire in basketball. There'll be the same in other sports where the umpires and referees get a small payment. There might be some coaches at the higher level that get a payment, but mostly at volunteer and children's sport in clubs, people are doing it all for free and just for the love of it.
Oh, thank you. Over to Dr. Usha.
Career, that is not of the community coaching. Does the level of participation have as an eligibility criteria? I'd like to enroll for a sports coach program. Then have I to have at this particular level of participation, only then I am considered as eligible? Do you have such a criteria? No.
Look, on my weekends, I coach athletics. So I'm a hurdles coach, hurdles and sprints. So I was involved in athletics. So I was a hurdler as a kid. But a lot of my colleagues in athletics coaching never ran, never did hurdles, never did high jump. But they became interested in the sport through their children, and then they did the coaching courses and have stayed and worked their way up to be quite high-level coaches. So sometimes a good athlete makes a good coach, but often a good athlete doesn't make a good coach because they can't teach what they do really well. So it's often other people that are interested in the sport but didn't play at a high level or even play at all that practice, get involved as a volunteer and then work their way up and train, and they then become the top coaches, but they didn't necessarily come from the sport.
That's right. Could I, Rosa, could you just give some of your remarks till I ask for the other questions, please?
Yeah. Maybe to the same question as it was asked before. For example, in Austria, we have a program, and it's also a program in the European Union that we try to keep, especially it's a girls program. Those girls who are not that much interested in competition and in high-level sports, but interested in teaching, in working with groups, and we try to keep them within the clubs in offering them to take part in a teaching course for coaches, and to develop skills for them in teaching and in coaching, and so that we could keep them in the club in another function more as well. In Europe and Germany and Austria, it's also a situation that if you're a volunteer, you don't get money for this work normally, but you get, for example, the expenses for traveling and so on. So if you would get money, then you are not a volunteer anymore. Then you are a professionally working in the area. So this is the differentiation. In our terms, if you're a volunteer, you do it more or less, the work more or less for free, just the expenses you get, and this makes the difference. But I have one question to Lisa as well, because she told about volunteer management. Could you say a bit more about this? It sounds very interesting, as a very interesting concept, especially maybe in context with governance, you've told as well.
Yeah, so there's two parts to that. So at the club level, and then at the state level, and then at the national level, each of those entities has a board or a committee that runs that particular sport. So part of the work we do is to make sure that the governance, or how that committee runs, is very good, because we find that if the governance isn't good, the club often gets themselves into trouble. So they don't have the right rules, they don't manage the money well, and the club may not exist for that long. So if people are on the web, you can go to our website, vicsport.com.au, and there's a governance toolkit that takes you through a million things, but it means that you have good governance. And then the other thing that's is quite new, particularly in Australia, is digital platforms that manage all the things volunteers need to do for you. So like Rosterify, which manages the rosters of volunteers. We have another entity that is called, it's called Sports Community, sportscommunity.com.au, and they have all different things about how to run a club, like job descriptions, how to run a meeting, what your finances should look like in the clubs, all the things that a club would need. And there's many companies and websites and small entities in Australia that are producing all the documentation that you need to run a club. Because what happens in community clubs in Australia is I might be the secretary of the local athletics club for 5 years, and when I leave, I take everything with me, and then someone has to start again. So we're trying to get everything on digital platforms so that things will exist when new people come onto committees for a club or a new coach starts, and then all the old information is still there rather than being taken by the old volunteer that left. So that's where that's kind of evolving. And yeah, so it's getting more sophisticated. We used to joke in Australia that most sporting clubs were run out of a shoebox. So all the papers in a shoebox. Now we're trying to get more sophisticated so that there's continuity of information.
Great. Yeah.
Maybe one other question you told about, and I find it very interesting that sports clubs just get funded if they have a quota of 40% women within the board. Question one: how could you manage to get this quota of 40% on the one hand, and on the other hand, what does it make with the clubs? How did they change their strategies?
Yeah, the quota is at the kind of state level. So Baseball Australia, Basketball Australia, and they have clubs underneath them. So the quota, we've started the quota at that state level, and then we're hoping that we'll move it down to club level. But at state level, it's quite unique to our state of Victoria. There was a study done by government that recognised what we all know, that women are not in enough leadership positions, particularly in sport. So they decided that they would make a policy for government that unless you have 40% women on your state sporting organisation board, so like Basketball Victoria, Baseball Victoria, you will not get government funding. And it was July 1, 2009, that if you didn't have 40% women on board by that date, you did not get government funding. So for the previous 3 years to that, VICSPORT, my organisation, worked with sport to make sure that they were changing what they did to be welcoming to women on their boards. Because as you will all know, a board meeting at night that goes for 4 hours when you need to put your kids to bed is not going to be a meeting that women will want to come to. So trying to get people to change their mindset to make sure they're encouraging women, people that are new to Australia, old people, young people, people with a disability, to come onto the board or the committee. You have to change how you do that board and how you do that committee and when you do it. So this environment of Zoom, we're using this a lot more now, but we're encouraging the use of these kind of environments so that people don't have to go to the clubhouse to have a board meeting or a committee meeting. They can stay home and then they can be included. So we went from 44% of state sporting organisations having 40% women on boards, and now we're at 98% in 3.5 years. So the policy works. Now our challenge is to make sure that we keep those women on the boards and that we encourage more diversity on boards. So not just women, but various people from different backgrounds, so that the board, what we want is the board to look like the members. You know, if I go to a football club down the road from my house, there will be people from all sorts of backgrounds playing football. There'll be old people, young people, people that are new to Australia. There'll be people with a disability. There'll be people that, you know, have not played before. There'll be people that have played for 20 years. But then the board or the committee might have 6 white men. So we want the board to look like the people that play the sport. So we want it to be diverse. We want it to be inclusive, and we want all different people thinking about how that sport can grow and be stronger. And we have to involve everyone for that to happen. So it's really important.
So, for example, for netball, it's a game with 100% women. Would they get funding because they're because we say
too many women?
Yeah,
yeah,
more than 40%, of course, but the other way around, it would be the same.
They do get funding, but they are encouraged to have more men on their board. So they have. It's like calisthenics is another sport that is dominated by women. So we are working with those sports to make sure they get more men on their board, because they obviously, it's not healthy for them to have only women thinking about the sport. We want to have men thinking about that sport as well. So it's kind of the opposite, but working in the same way.
Yeah. So could I just ask what is about the calisthenics? Can you just elaborate onto that part?
Calisthenics, do you have calisthenics in India?
We do have, but not in terms of the board. Like I didn't know that we don't have. We just have practice, or we have heard about what it is, but we're not brought in a structured way.
So we have calisthenics in my state is quite popular. So as you know, calisthenics is, I call it a cross between dance and gymnastics with choreography to music. It's fascinating. I love it as a sport. But we have about 50 calisthenics clubs in my state. So girls and boys, but mostly girls, they will come to the club that will be in a particular hall or some kind of facility indoor, and they will practice their routines, and then they will present those routines at club and state championships and try to work their way up to Australian championships. So those clubs are organised, they have committees, and those committees then run that club so that the participants can compete in calisthenics each week. So that's basically how it works. And it's the same pretty much for each different sport, a similar way that they work.
That's great. It was indeed, I think it was you could say it was such an interesting, informative session. So could I ask just Rosa, could you just sum up on what Lisa has said, and then I'll ask Dr. Kishore sir later to speak.
Mm-hmm. So it was a very interesting presentation of Lisa and the Australian situation. On the one hand, knowing that there are different reasons why people join voluntarily a sports club. On the other hand, she told about different programs which are very interesting and hopefully also for India interesting, which programs, which strategies could be successful, what about the welcome structure and the welcome approach to get people into the clubs. Also the situation on, there could be problems on the other hand, but also very interestingly was the governance and welcoming aspect and the volunteer management, because this could be transferred quite easily to other structures, and it shows where are the approaches, what could we do in the educational system for coaches, in the educational system for volunteers as well, and knowing that there are incentives on the one hand, but you have to look at when you could recruit the people. So it's also a management strategy you need behind if you want to have volunteers in a sports system.
Thank you so much, Rosa. May I now request Dr. Kishore sir?
Yeah.
Sir.
And it was a wonderful presentation, and both by two eminent distinguished personalities from Australia, and Lisa and Rosa. We know that you are very, very busy and spearheading many programs in Australia and around the world. So it was quite enlightening to listen from you, especially on one of the movements which has caught up the world's attention. And I would like to state that I was also a part of this volunteer movement in Australia in 2006 when I came to Melbourne as part of Indian delegation to get trained under Australian Sports Commission. Yes, and I was staying in one of the apartments near Riara River, and I fondly remember and cherish those memories. We got trained in volunteering, and I was a volunteer during 2006 Melbourne Commonwealth Games. So that's a wonderful thing. But one small, I would like to get a clarification from both distinguished speakers about how do the Australian government distinguish between this PE program, physical education programs, and elite sports. Is there any separate body to look after the PE programs? And the budgeting, is the government budget earmarked for PE programs and community coaching, fitness, and the grassroots training and all? Or it becomes a part of the Australian Sports Commission? Is there any new, as per policy, any new revised guidelines or any new system or schemes in force in Australia right now? You may kindly give a brief. If not, if you, otherwise you can send it to us also. And about the budgeting also, how much budget is earmarked for the PE programs from the Australian sports from the sports budget? How much is earmarked for PE and community groups? And what are the leading programs which are at present there with this operation, with this being operated?
I'll give it a go, Doctor. The PE programs in Australia are very much centred around what is delivered in schools. So whether it be a private school or a government school, they are supported by trained phys ed teachers like our welcomed listeners today, and they are supported by organisations such as, we call it here, ACHPA, Australian College for Health, Physical Education and Recreation, and that organisation helps train teachers to do PE in schools better. So while I train sport to do sport better, ACHPA trains teachers to do teaching PE better. So they work on that. The private schools are entirely funded by the parents, and their physical education programs and curriculum and sport is funded by the parents. The government schools are funded by each state government, and you know, we're pushing for more and more PE in schools because a lot of kids aren't getting enough PE, like teaching skills in schools, and they're only getting sport outside schools. And then sport is kind of a separate entity run by the community and funded by federal and state government, and where community pays a membership fee to be part of a club, and they get into that system and work with the coach. So if I'm a student, if I was a 15-year-old boy who loved basketball, I would probably play basketball for my school, and my PE teacher, I would do basketball in PE, and I would learn some skills from my PE teacher. But I would also join a club outside school, and I would have a separate coach that would coach me for that club, and I would play with my friends that probably come from various different schools, and we would play together outside school hours. And then when I'm back at school, I would do basketball in PE class, but I probably would also put the school singlet on and play for my school as well. So someone that is very good at a sport in Australia will play for their school, they will play for their club outside school with a separate group of people, and they will work their way up to play for their region and their state, and then maybe Australia. So, you know, very talented kids, or kids that just love a sport that might not be that good, would play in school and outside school. So they get a lot of sport. When I worked in basketball, there were some children playing basketball every day in a competition, as well as training. So sometimes it's probably a bit much. But yeah, so the community system is funded by government and membership fees, and the school system is funded by parents if it's private, and a bit by government, and the government system mostly by state governments. So that, hopefully that kind of answers your question.
Yeah.
And it is compulsory. Physical education is a part of curriculum or optional in the Australian school?
It's part of the curriculum. Sport is usually optional, so playing a particular sport in a school, but PE is meant to be part of the curriculum. But we're finding in some parts of schools, particularly in primary schools where the children are young, if there's not a professional PE teacher, they might not be getting as much PE as we would like.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Rosa?
Maybe I could comment from the European perspective. There's a bit different. There are quite big differences because sports and being physically active in one kind of sport like basketball is not the issue of school and PE. PE is offering a diverse range of sport activities, physical activities, body sensations. It's more an educational perspective in PE, and the government is paying everything. But there are cooperations between sports clubs and schools, so that there, for example, soccer and volleyball is very typical. You have a school club, which is offering basketball, soccer, and there are some competitions. But if you want to be a basketball player or something like that, then you're normally going to a sports club. This is the place where you compete, and this is the place where you are making the career as a sports. And in Austria, the schools are not known for being a basketball school or a volleyball school or a soccer school. This is not like in America, US, or in the Anglo, like Australia, for example. It's quite different. So school is for everybody. We have normally 4 hours a week physical education in school. It's obligatory for every pupil, and sports is for those who are interested in. During the last years, we have a program in daily PE. That means that pupils should have the opportunity, schools have the obligation that each child gets 60 minutes a day of moderate to vigorous physical activity, how it is known that WHO supports this strategy, being active, that to get being healthy. And this provoked cooperations of PE, and in the afternoon the sports clubs are coming to school and offering different kind of sports. So, but being a sports athlete, then you're going to sports club, and this is funded by sports ministry. So more diverse and different systems.
I think we're certainly more aligned in Australia with Rosa in Europe than we are with America, where it's all run in school and college. So there's closer alignment there.
Mm-hmm.
So Kishore sir?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this was both the presentation by Lisa and supplemented by Rosa was quite informative. I'm sure that the entire participants, the physical education fraternity of the country would have been benefited by, and we will keep interacting with you and in touch with you, and also appreciate your time and efforts made to participate. On behalf of Ministry of Sports, Government of India, and SAI Sports Authority of India, place on record our sincere appreciation and thanks to both Madam Lisa and Madam Rosa for their graceful presence and their contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kishore sir. And Kishore sir is, as I mentioned, Principal and Region Director for the Kerala region with the Sports Authority of India. And for the information of all the participants, Lisa and Rosa are very busy. She had to attend, she's doing multitasking right now. She's attending calls and talking to us. And I really need to thank you, because I wanted somebody from Australia, but I'm happy, Janice. I need to thank Janice in absence. But ma'am, for your information, we had about almost 1,300 party teachers who were listening to you. And I'm sure it's one of the biggest strengths that, among the other speakers that you could have. And we would always look forward to you. And we are indebted to you for your valuable presence, and we look forward to your guidance too. So Lisa ma'am, thank you so much. And Rosa, being the Vice President of the International Association for Sport and Physical Education, we have this organization with us, which has made us so strong. And I think this has become an international forum where our PE teachers are able to get an international exposure. That is what we were looking forward to. And Dr. Kishore wanted the same, including our Director General, Sandeep Pradhan sir, was very keen. So on behalf of the Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports, Khelo India, and SAI, the Sports Authority of India, Lakshmibai National College of Physical Education, I need to thank LisaHasker, a special thanks. Rosa, thanks. And Principal sir, thank you so much, because you find them sitting throughout and listening. And there are many others who are listening to you, all the invited guests, thank you so much. And my dear participants, without you, I don't think this would have been a success. I'd like to thank Dr. Sanjay Prajapati too, all those who have helped to make this session a grand one. Once again, thank you one and all.